If we were to create a list of the most contentious territories in the world, I'm confident Israel would rank near the top. When we examine its history, there's simply no contest. There's ongoing conflict in Palestine. It doesn't matter what year, century, or even millennium you consider. For thousands of years, the land contested by Palestinians and Israelis has been a tinderbox seemingly destined for violence and animosity. In this video, we'll delve into the history of Israel, from ancient times to the present, highlighting key events that will provide a better understanding of what's happening in this age-old land. Because in this region, things are far more complex than they appear at first glance. Welcome to the history of Israel. The 12 tribes of Israel settled there between 1200 BC and 1050 BC. The Jews are one of those peoples who have preserved their traditions and beliefs over time, thanks to sources like the Old Testament, where history and religion intertwine. The thing is, around the 2nd millennium BC, the Hebrews arrived in the lands we now know as Palestine, and they had to fight against those who were already there, who were the Canaanites. In this map, you can see how the 12 tribes of Israel were distributed, and this area labeled Philistines was a people who were not Jewish, so war between both peoples was common, and coincidentally, their territory aligns quite well with the current Gaza Strip. But we should not think that the Philistines are the ancestors of the Palestinians, and that these 12 tribes are the ancestors of modern Israelis. The reality is that genetic studies have shown that they all have common ancestors, meaning they are basically the same ethnicity, but practicing different religions. It's supposed that all the tribes were unified by Jewish kings as important as David or his son, Solomon, who built the Great Temple of Jerusalem. From there, nothing but problems, and the idea of recovering the greatness of the past. Assyrians and Babylonians conquered the lands, destroyed the temple, and, as the Jews kept causing trouble, they suffered the first deportations to the Middle East. Later on, the Persian Empire, Greeks, and Romans. The power of Rome spread throughout the Mediterranean, including the Kingdom of Judea. It was in that context that the belief in a Messiah became fashionable. A legendary warrior, or king foretold by the ancient prophets, to liberate Israel from its oppressors. Thus, Christianity was born, as a twist on this messianic concept around the figure of Jesus Christ. But not all Jews believed that Jesus was the Messiah. Those who did believe became known as Christians, and those who didn't continued to call themselves Jews. They became so obsessed with the issue of messianism and liberation that eventually 2 strong revolts against Rome erupted. The first between 66 and 73 AD, which led to the destruction of the Second Temple of Solomon, of which only the Western Wall remains today. But, not content with that, in the 2nd century, during the reign of Hadrian, there was a second revolt, and things reached a boiling point, to the extent that Hadrian, fed up with the Jews, took a drastic solution, deporting virtually the entire Jewish population to scatter them across the corners of the Roman Empire. This is what we know as the Great Jewish Diaspora, and it had significant and dramatic consequences. Furthermore, remember this territory? The one of the Philistines? Well, Rome changed the name of the entire area to call it Palestine based on a Philistine term to humiliate the Jews and definitively quell their desire for war, to leave them as foreigners in their own land. So from now on, the Philistines are known as Palestinians. The Jews, after the Great Diaspora, settled in regions as distant as the Iberian Peninsula. The Middle Ages were not easy, always marked, marginalized, and not fitting in anywhere. Many kingdoms ended up expelling them from their borders for social, religious, and often economic reasons, as they were usually moneylenders or engaged in jobs typical of the medieval bourgeoisie. Meanwhile, in Palestine, things got even more complicated. By the time of Emperor Constantine, in the 4th century, what was considered sacred land for the Jews had also been added as sacred land for Christians, as the holy sites for followers of Jesus Christ were also there. But it doesn't end there. In 638, the entire region of Syria and Palestine fell under Arab rule. And guess what? Yes, for them, Jerusalem was also a sacred city. From that moment on, Islam spread throughout the region to this day. And that's how the Palestinians, i.e., the local inhabitants who did not practice Judaism, converted to Islam. Palestine was part of the Islamic domain of the Ottoman Empire until the 20th century. Over time, the Jewish reality in Europe remained very complicated. Many saw emigration to countries like the United States as a solution to persecution, condemned to wander from one place to another. Particularly harsh were the pogroms, or lynchings, that they suffered in Eastern Europe during the 19th century, when Jews were persecuted, singled out, and murdered by crowds, spontaneously and with false accusations. As a result of these persecutions, many Jews considered the possibility of settling in Palestine, which they considered the homeland and sacred land of their ancestors, and it was in the late 19th century when the first Aliyah occurred, a term that aimed to reverse the diaspora. Many began to buy land from Arab landowners and Ottoman authorities to recolonize the land of Canaan. By the way, if you're enjoying the video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe. A small gesture like this is crucial for YouTube to understand that this is good content and for the channel to succeed. Thank you very much. Moving into the 20th century, a naturalized Hungarian Jew, Theodor Herzl, laid the groundwork for Zionism, a social and political movement with nationalist undertones advocating for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, promoting Jewish migration to the Promised Land as a definitive solution to the multiple persecutions they continued to face. After World War I and the disappearance of the Ottoman Empire, the newly formed League of Nations granted Britain a mandate over the land of Palestine, and things began to get complicated. Many Palestinians observed that the British authorities looked favorably upon the arrival of Jews, as seen in the Balfour Declaration, when the British Prime Minister declared support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people. The modern conflict was beginning. It's time to get serious. As we've seen, the situation of Jews in Europe was never straightforward. Despite often holding high positions in society, they were always under conspiratorial suspicions, distrusted by the rest of the population, and singled out as the necessary scapegoats to justify the political, economic, and military failures of liberalism and nationalism. As early as 1919, when Hitler began his political career, he identified Jews as the main enemies of German society, blaming them for many of the nation's woes and even the humiliating defeat in World War I, sealed in a Treaty of Versailles that the fascist leader considered a betrayal orchestrated by the enemies of the state. For Hitler, Jews had to be confined and exterminated, but not in a crude and disorganized manner like the pogroms. Rather, it was a matter of state that required institutions, means, and resources for its effective execution. All of these ideas should have remained something anecdotal, typical of one of the many self-proclaimed visionaries who aimed to save the world by destroying it. But interwar Europe showed us the harsh face of contemporary politics and nationalist fanaticism. The Nazi Party came to power under the leadership of Hitler. Shortly thereafter, they passed the Nuremberg Laws in 1935, which denied citizenship to Jews and significantly restricted their civil rights. Violence against Jews escalated, and many were directly transported to occupy the first places in concentration camps. Others left Germany for free countries, fleeing from a genuine terror campaign that had only just begun. With the outbreak of World War II, the Jewish question took a step further. Poland was a country with a high Jewish population, so thousands of people were confined, stripped of their lives before the war, in neighborhoods called ghettos, under inhuman and overcrowded conditions, while a solution to the issue was being planned. Between 1941 and 1942, the German SS carried out the final solution. So Himmler, the great leader of the SS, was provided with all the necessary means to exterminate the Jews as efficiently as possible. The first mass deportations to camps, not just concentration camps but extermination camps, began to take place. Camps like Belzec, Mauthausen, Treblinka, or Auschwitz, where modern gas chambers and high-capacity crematoria were in full operation until the end of the war. It is estimated that nearly 11 million people, including Jews and other ethnic or political groups, were exterminated, a harsh figure for our collective memory. All these crimes were judged in the Nuremberg trials, whose parallelism with the place where the first anti-racial laws were established was not coincidental. There, many of the Nazi leaders who had survived the war and who had perpetrated such barbarity were tried and sentenced to death in many cases by the Allied powers. You may wonder what was happening in Palestine while the Nazi nightmare ravaged Europe. The reality is that the United Kingdom, which still had the mandate in the area, was forced to restrict the increasing arrival of Jewish immigrants, driven by the terror campaign spreading across Europe. In Palestinian lands, the Jewish National Agency was already operating, responsible for coordinating the arrival of immigrants. This agency would later become the origin of the State of Israel. However, the Palestinians, who initially welcomed the arrival of Jews as they could sell them land and enrich themselves, began to show their rejection when the number of Hebrews became very high. Additionally, Jewish terrorist groups emerged, such as the Lehi or the Irgun, which aimed to pressure the British, adding to the conflict between Palestinians and Jews that was already unfolding, amid uncertainty about the future of the region for both parties. Their strategy was simple: to set off bombs and cause chaos to try to force the British to leave the area. If the British left, they could establish their own state. With the end of World War II, international pressure increased to find a destination for the thousands of refugees resulting from the liberation of Europe, thousands of Jews displaced from their homes who were unable to resolve their situation after the war. All of this resulted in organized mass immigration to Israel. To some extent, the world felt indebted to the Jewish people after the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed. It could be said that the shame over what had happened in Germany forced many countries to decide that a country should be founded for the Jews. The role of the United Kingdom in this situation was not easy. It was a powder keg about to explode, and trying to appease the demands of both sides seemed impossible. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 181, which proposed the partition of the territories of Palestine, resulting in an impossible puzzle and leaving Jerusalem within a neutral zone directly controlled by the UN. In this map, we can see the Jewish settlements in 1946. As we can observe on the map, the UN plan sought to unify the areas of majority Islamic and Jewish populations, while also dividing the region into two parts with a very similar surface area. It also aimed to ensure that both states had access to the sea and could communicate between their separate parts. This artificial map only anticipated that the conflict would worsen. Furthermore, the Arab world vehemently opposed the creation of Israel, threatening to use all necessary measures if the plan was executed. On May 14, 1948, the United Kingdom abandoned its mandate over Palestine, leaving this territory to its fate. Immediately, the State of Israel was declared in Tel Aviv, under the auspices of the international community, and led by David Ben-Gurion. A day later, the Arab League Liberation Army, composed of countries like Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, crossed the newly drawn borders. The war had begun. To understand the complex situation of the territory encompassing Israel and Palestine, we must delve into the key aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which shaped the map we know today in the Middle East. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War lasted from May of that year until July 1949. In this conflict, the intervention of Arab countries aimed at establishing a single Arab-Palestinian state, with the invasion of Israeli borders being rejected by the international community. The newly created Israel Defense Forces attempted to halt the Arab advance, hoping for reinforcements and resources with which to defend themselves. The fiercest battles were fought between the cities of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, while the UN proposed several ceasefires in an attempt to resolve the conflict through diplomatic channels, but without success. However, against all odds, the Jews were able to contain the Arab coalition, which failed to achieve its objectives. At the signing of the armistice, Israel had managed to consolidate and expand its territories beyond the borders set by the UN. The Arab League occupied the areas originally intended for the Palestinians, such as the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. The city of Jerusalem was divided into two parts, one Jewish and one Arab. In other words, Israel took more territory than assigned by the UN, but in its defense, it could argue that since all its neighbors had declared war on it, it could take it by right of conquest. The situation in the Middle East did not improve with Nasser's rise to power in Egypt. One of Nasser's government measures was the nationalization of the Suez Canal, a major artery of world trade, which directly affected the interests of the United Kingdom and France. Additionally, he blocked the Straits of Tiran, Israel's access to Asian trade. Egypt continued to pressure the Jews in this way, leading the defense of the interests of the Arab League. France and the United Kingdom secretly formed an alliance with Israel, in which they would launch a surprise attack on Egypt to regain Western control of the area. Between October and November 1956, Israel had already conquered the entire Sinai Peninsula. Both the United States and the Soviet Union opposed this operation. The UN acted to declare a ceasefire and pressured Israel to retreat to the pre-conflict situation. Additionally, it took charge of the demilitarization and control of the border, which, on the other hand, helped prevent the actions of terrorist groups sponsored by Egypt. The presence of UN peacekeepers on the border between Egypt and Israel brought relative peace. However, Nasser called for revenge, and the UN withdrawal in 1967 rekindled the conflict, with Egypt once again blocking the Straits of Tiran. Members of the Arab League began to concentrate troops on the borders, prompting Israel to take action and launch a preemptive attack. Between June 5 and 10, 1967, Israel put its enemies on the defensive and, in just 6 days, expanded its territory back to the Sinai Peninsula. It also occupied the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights, as well as the entirety of the city of Jerusalem. With this apparent great victory, Israel transitioned from a small country defending itself against its enemies to an attacking power, occupying territories beyond its borders. Additionally, its control over Gaza or the West Bank contributed to the development of Palestinian nationalism and increased rejection by the international community. The Soviet Union definitively withdrew its support. Nasser died in 1970 and was succeeded in power by Anwar el-Sadat. During October 1973, coinciding with Yom Kippur, one of the most important holidays for Jews, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights, respectively. Both countries wanted to regain what they considered theirs, following the disaster of the Six-Day War. The conflict gained another layer of complexity when, within the context of the Cold War, the United States and its allies supported Israel while the Soviet Union supported the Arab countries. Although initially the situation seemed favorable to the Arab coalition, which made rapid progress, the Israeli army managed to halt its enemies and reverse the situation. The UN had to intervene again to contain a situation that was escalating very quickly. Peace negotiations extended until 1978, when the Camp David Accords were signed. In these accords, Israel committed to returning the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt and granting gradual autonomy to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank in exchange for peace. Egypt, in turn, would recognize the existence of the State of Israel, becoming the first Arab country to do so. This is significant because, for over 30 years, not a single Arab country had recognized Israel's right to exist. While Israel was fighting against everyone around it, the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, was born within its borders. It was formed by a combination of political and paramilitary organizations, such as Al-Fatah or the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Its relevance grew in the 1960s, while Jerusalem was divided between Jews and Arabs. The UN initially recognized it as the representative and spokesperson of the Palestinian people. Under the leadership of prominent figures like Yasser Arafat, this organization led Palestinian resistance in the occupied Gaza Strip and West Bank, becoming the #1 enemy for Jewish authorities. Additionally, as thousands of Palestinians had fled to the north, this justified the PLO's actions in Lebanon as well, especially as a complex civil war with religious characteristics between Muslims and Christians erupted there, lasting from 1975 to 1990. Israel, which had already intervened on the border with Lebanon due to numerous Palestinian incursions from there, decided to cross it again between June 1982 and 1985, invading the neighboring country with the intention of expelling the PLO from there, eventually capturing Beirut. This directly influenced the course of the Lebanese civil war. The void left by the PLO was filled in the south by Hezbollah, a Lebanese Shiite political and military group supported by Iran. In Iran, in 1979, an Islamic revolution occurred, transforming the country into a theocracy that decided to lead an all-out conflict against Israel. Ultimately, the Israeli army withdrew to its initial positions, leaving a security zone occupied in southern Lebanon. It remained there until the 2000s. The end of the civil war in Lebanon did not mark the end of Hezbollah, which has continued to operate, supported by Iran and always with Israel in its crosshairs. In the late 1980s, the first intifada erupted in the Gaza Strip. Violent protests with a clear Islamic religious motivation quickly spread throughout all Palestinian-occupied territories, demanding freedom and the ability to decide their own future. From Algeria, the PLO attempted to regain the initiative by proclaiming the independence of the State of Palestine in 1988. In this declaration, it implicitly recognized the existence of the State of Israel and renounced violence as a political weapon. It delineated the original borders of the plan approved by the UN, establishing the Palestinian capital in Jerusalem. Under the auspices of the United States and international organizations, efforts were made to seek a diplomatic solution to the conflict through the Oslo Accords in 1993. In these accords, Israel would remain the sole responsible party for the external borders of the region, recognizing the establishment of Palestinian self-government, the Palestinian National Authority, but without conceding the city of Jerusalem. However, Israel has been very conservative, lifting control over the West Bank and Gaza very slowly. In fact, since the early 2000s, Israel has even begun building Jewish settlements within the West Bank, contradicting what it had agreed to just 10 years earlier. It has also constructed a massive wall separating Israel from the West Bank. However, this wall also does not respect the agreements and encroaches into Palestinian territory. This has led to sporadic conflicts continuing to make headlines around the world, such as the outbreak of the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, when Israel was finishing constructing a border wall. Things were far from being resolved due to the rise of Hamas, which is considered a political terrorist group with jihadist characteristics, meaning it takes Islamic ideas to the extreme. The irony of this organization is that it seems to have been originally sponsored by Israel, with the aim of weakening the authority of the PLO and creating conflicts within the Palestinian faction. With the signing of the Oslo Accords, Hamas led the opposition, labeling the Palestinian authorities who agreed to negotiate as traitors. The internal confrontation between Hamas and the PLO became evident with the transfer of the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian National Authority. Suicide bombings became frequent since then. With the strengthening of international jihadism in the 2000s, Hamas came to power in the Gaza Strip through parliamentary elections. The exchange of pinpoint attacks has been frequent, but the situation exploded in October 2023, when a coordinated raid from the Gaza Strip into Israeli territory left over 1,200 civilian casualties and a high number of captured hostages. This led to a new occupation of the Gaza Strip by the Israeli army and the reactivation of all conflict hotspots, including the one in the north with Hezbollah, in addition to the predominant threat from Iran. Why is peace not achieved between Israel and Palestine? Broadly speaking, for decades, Palestinians and Arab neighbors refused to recognize Israel's right to exist. However, since 1993, this has changed and Palestinians did recognize it, although there are groups like Hamas that still oppose it. But then Israel decided to refuse to recognize Palestine. Furthermore, in Israel, the far-right Zionist movement has grown significantly, whose intention is for Israel to directly occupy all of Palestine. Currently, it is impossible to form a government majority without the far-right Zionist movement, whose sole purpose is not peace but expanding into both territories. With such a situation, peace seems impossible. What do you think? How do you believe peace could be achieved in the region? If you've made it this far, give a thumbs up, subscribe, click on the notifications bell, and let us know if you liked the video. We will be uploading more videos related to geopolitics, as well as geography and history. Thank you very much, and greetings.